Hello, this is John from Gideon Corp, sounding like a robot. Today I am talking about the AI bubble, and we'll go over what that means. Additionally, the reason I have a hood on is to block out the sunlight. It is for no other reason. Breaking news. So, one thing to start off with is, look, in summary, the video should effectively state that it is because the ability of language models has been very overstated that naturally should have been relatively obvious that these models had been overvalued and their associated companies overvalued for a while. Now, we're going to start off with a discussion of what bubbles are. So a few months ago, I reviewed a book by David DeRosa on bursting the bubble. So that is a discussion of multiple models going over, for example, the autoregressive models developed to detect bubbles, and effectively, among other statistical models as well, like Garch models and so on. The main conclusion that David DeRosa had drawn was that there was no convincing evidence for the existence of traditional bubbles. Additionally, it's worth understanding that bubbles may not exist, or the financial theory of efficient markets may not be correct, which would be a big issue, of course, for understanding the value of investments. Now, a bubble does not mean that the asset value will go to zero once the dust clears. It simply means that there's likely going to be a significant correction when investors realize that the demand for those assets has exceeded their actual value. In other words, they sell assets and drive the price down when they realize it's time to get out. So predicting the size of the bubble, I think, is kind of pointless at this stage, because there's no way to know for sure, but it's probably material. So in excess of 5%, I think, is reasonable to think, and I would expect this bubble to consolidate sometime around the release of GPT-6. So let's go over the evidence of the bubble. And again, I think that the markets should probably have been ahead on this one significantly, because I think it's just relatively obvious, to be honest with you. And the main, I think, the smoking gun is really the performance of the language models. But let's go over this. So, first is that there's circulating money. So effectively, from my understanding, there's connected companies moving money around each other, including, NVIDIA and OpenAI. So that might suggest that some of the valuation is already arbitrarily inflated. The second is that the tech doesn't work that well, and that's not entirely true in some cases. And really, it's not so much that the tech doesn't work well, but that the performance of the tech in the present has been significantly overstated. So, for example, a combination of reinforcement learning, large language models, and human utilization was recently used to win the Math Olympiad, which is a significant achievement for sure. But it's worth understanding two things. The first is that these are not research level questions. The second is that the idea that the reinforcement learning models, for example, are going to replace humans entirely is silly to think, certainly at this stage. And similar thing with language models. A third, maybe I should just start highlighting this. I mean, I do have it up on Excel. Okay, hallucinations is the third reason. Basically, AI hallucinations have been resulting in what's now termed AI-induced psychosis, where people believe that they are discovering, for example, something much greater than they actually are, because it just sort of, take ChatGPT, for example, it just kind of says it does things it says it knows things and it really doesn't. Now, what I think is going to happen is that this will probably result in a class action lawsuit, because this is there's growing awareness around the issue, and it appears to me, and very interestingly, I had been telling somebody that I do think that this is possibly a feature, and won't be old. Although I can't read this, I did find a Nature article on exactly that. Isn't that interesting? Today. So, very cool. So yeah, but I think we'll likely see a class action lawsuit come from that. I don't know when, but I think that's just the sensible conclusion from that, given that that is literally always been the case when these kinds of things happen, and it's often destructive to companies. And some companies have thought of themselves, we'll be fine when the class action clears. Okay, then there's also issues. So I suppose number 4, there's issues with things like chip shortages, including sort of rare minerals in China and Taiwan that are very necessary for the AI companies in the US. We may see a shortage or issues with continuing to harvest those materials to expand. So that's worth. Sorry, I'm getting like messages right now. Very distracting. That's worth discussing and mentioning, because if those shortages come to fruition, obviously those companies can expand, and that's also going to exert downward pressure on their share price. Okay, energy consumption. It's very obvious, first, that climate change is obviously a real thing, and the growing concern around energy consumption could pose an issue for mostly the pre-training of language models. So to clarify this issue, basically you can engage in the training process of language models either pre or post training. Pre-training is referring to, we have a language model, we code it, we train it from scratch on our data set, usually a very large unstructured data set, and it creates the parameters in the neural network to work from. And what you can do afterwards is get yourself involved in post-training, which is less energy intensive. Pre-training is extremely energy intensive, and it takes tens of millions of dollars to do. But the post-training is what is known as fine-tuning, and that takes a smaller amount of data, it takes significantly less energy, and it takes significantly less resources to do. And the difference is, instead of creating the parameters and their original weights, you're simply tweaking the weights. The fine-tuning process itself can be extremely variable. For example, you can identify which parameters in particular you would like to modify the weights of, or at the layers. So yeah, in which case we'll go over the structure of a neural network soon. Just the basics, nothing complicated. Okay, what is this, 5th? 6th issue is the vibe coding nonsense. I think this is just going to come to an end very soon. It's very clear to, I think, everyone who knows how to program that it's not very good. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. And then a lot of ChatGPT, or a lot of AI projects now, are simply taking ChatGPT, giving it prompts, and quote-unquote prompt engineering. I'm not going to say very much about this. Everyone, I think, understands this is not resulting in valuable companies that are just rebranding ChatGPT. So I think there's a lot of peripheral, smaller investments being made in companies that arguably don't really bring anything to the table. And I'm very serious about that, by the way, because you'll hear all kinds of stuff like, I can make my language model consistent with chain of thought prompting. No, you can't. You can't. Okay? And I know you can't. Okay, moving on. And I will just mention, by the way, one of the things, and it's kind of funny, I suppose, that I'm not going to say I talk smack about AI, because there are other models aside from just language models, and language models are very interesting still, but the utilization and adoption by businesses has been, to give you one example, I'm not going to say which grant they won, I'm not going to say which company either, but I was listening to the founder of one company talk about his AI, and I think just in summary, it was extremely embarrassing to listen to. I was not convinced that they have any idea how this technology works, and therefore I think their investors did not either. So just extremely embarrassing. Yeah, okay. I, at this company, am working on a utilization of AI that I can't talk about very much. So I do have additional insight into the whole prompt engineering thing and its competitive advantages in the market, or at least a perspective on that. Okay, moving on. Okay, so why not, basically? Why might there not be an AI bubble, or why might this tech not be valued yet? And this is largely a discussion about speculation on future uses for the models and their ability to improve. So one is that I do think that there's probably clear improvements to make on the architecture. So effectively, and I'm just going to show a couple things here now for that, is that if we look at the structure of a neural network, effectively, which a language model is basically a neural network with some additional encoding and decoding steps, and some other stuff like attention layers, etc. But you basically have inputs. They go through activation functions and they give an output. It's relatively straightforward. These are directed graphical models. And the activation functions basically give a function for the threshold of whether or not that node or neuron will be activated and pass information along to the next one. So what I want to make kind of clear is that the neural networks used in computer science are by no coincidence very similar to the way that neurons work in the brain. And, so anyways, like most people, I do have a copy of Reshevsky's Mathematical Biophysics on my shelf. So anyways, this book does go over quite a bit on things like activation functions in the second chapter. But the architecture itself is almost the same. The way that a neuron works is you have, for example, information that gets passed along. You have an activation function that tells you if the neuron did or did not get activated. There's different weights to those inputs depending on where they come from and where they end up, and so on. So it's very clear to me, at least, that there are things in which the models do not utilize yet that the brain's architecture does use that could be implemented, and it will likely result in improvements to the architectural efficiency. Right now, the way that most of these companies seem to be approaching it is by adding more parameters. But if I had to guess, I don't think that's actually going to work super well. Now, it's possible that I'm wrong because, let's just move down to this point for a second. It's unclear if the emergent properties are just stochastic processing, but I have to guess that they're not, that they are, because for example, the number of neurons in the brain is significantly less than those of an LLM, which suggests that I don't think that these are real emergent properties. Anyways, okay, moving on. So in order to improve those models, by the way, my point is that I think, very clearly, and there's lots of other researchers, I believe, that are in agreement that the architecture obviously needs to be improved instead of just adding more weights. Okay, so there are likely unexplored use cases for the models as well. I think that most language models are simply used to develop like chat bots at the moment, and we're just seeing the development of large reasoning models, but I don't believe they work very well at the moment because they're just modified language models with chain of thought prompting. But cool. Okay, AI isn't just LLMs, so there's also models like reinforcement learning models that we talked about earlier, which can also then get subdivided into, for example, Q learning. Just one example. So that might suggest as well that the overemphasis on language models is potentially temporary, and maybe we'll see money in the sphere shift from language models to some other kind of model for a while. Okay, so then some reasons that are totally unclear whether they're positive or negative for the valuation of AI companies. The first is that emergent properties may or may not really be stochastic processing of events, right? So basically the idea of an emergent property is that you, at a certain scale, can have the language model do things that it was not trained to do without updating the parameter weights. There doesn't really seem to be any theory on why this occurs other than basically the distributions. So when the language model decides what it's going to do, it utilizes a probability distribution of events to select an event. So by training a model on a larger array of parameters, you can essentially end up with perhaps more like broad distributions that capture a larger set of random events. But that's not really, I think, going to improve consistent performance in any respect. But it might, because it's possible that the theory of theorizing this in terms of probability distributions may not be correct. So that's worth mentioning. Okay, it's unclear to me if investors actually know where to put their money. Arguably, this is a bad thing as well, but I don't know. They might understand the technology better than I think they do, in which case they may have a better grasp on these issues than I currently think they do. And then it's also unclear if businesses are potentially covering up for economic circumstances. So I think everyone's well aware that quote unquote AI is going to take their job. For me, that would be very difficult to believe unless businesses did not care at all for the ability of their employees to perform, because it certainly cannot replace anyone who knows what they're doing. And it makes mistakes all the time. It doesn't matter how you try to give it instructions. It's not consistent. It can't be completely consistent. It's a statistical impossibility that it would be, because it utilizes random distributions to come up with its outcomes. You can, however, run things multiple times, and that can get around that issue in many cases where you don't have to, where you have literally more than like one shot to do something. So maybe that's not necessarily a problem. But even so, the fact that it makes mistakes approximately 1 in 5 times still necessitates expertise on topics to assess whether or not those mistakes have been made. So given that it really cannot replace anyone, it's a big question as to why companies would say that it can. And I think, my thinking about that is that they're likely trying to cover up for the economic circumstances, which is that right now, pretty much all of North America is in an economic downturn that's becoming worse over time. We all know why. Becoming worse over time, which means that it's time for companies to start laying people off. And one way to get around the issue of, because if you lay people off, it's a signal to investors that your company isn't doing so well. So maybe they start pulling your money away and your stock price goes down. And if you're an executive, you probably have options on the company. So one way to get around that issue could be, well, we're not cutting people because we're doing bad. We're cutting people because we become more efficient with AI. And well, if it's the case that investors don't have any idea about how the technology actually performs, and they've been badgering these executives to implement AI anyways, well, maybe this is a true story, but it's not guaranteed to be. Okay, so anyways, I think just the most important thing to take away from all this, and the reason why I think that it's overvalued, just has to do mostly with the performance of the technology, but there are some other issues that are likely going to prop up over the next year, I would think. Yeah, so I think we'll likely see this come to an end, I think like late 2026. Not an end, but maybe just something to pay attention to. If you are invested, then you can take that as something to be aware of. And this is completely my opinion, obviously, though we have gathered facts on the topic to come up with this opinion, of course. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say. Goodbye. Like and subscribe and comment. Share it with your friends. Bye.